During breaking news, the likes of which we've been covering this week, more and more people turn to search engines and to social media to help them sort out the story. What happens when those search engines, when Google and Facebook lead people astray? Take a look at these. Examples of the fake posts circulating on the internet after the Vegas shooting, misidentifying the gunman, misidentifying victims. The question is, how does that happen? How do stories like that, how do they rise to the surface, and what are the consequences of that? Our senior technology reporter, Matthew Braga, has obviously been very interested in that part of the story, and here with me this morning. Okay, so we had fake news, as I said, about victims, about who the shooter was, of course, later identified. Basically, they were wrong.
They were incorrect. And there were two cases that I think are kind of worth highlighting in this context. So in one case, we had Google, right? People going to Google and searching for information about possible sort of, identities of the shooter. And there was one name that had sort of emerged early on that people had sort of believed might have been responsible. And so they were going to Google, they were searching for this name. And instead of coming up with, a link to CBC or CNN or NBC or some sort of reputable news site, they were being sent to essentially a sort of dark forum of the internet, right, where hoaxes and misinformation is often spread. A place called 4chan, where people were discussing the identity of one of the believed sort of, one of the names of someone who later proved to not be the shooter. And that was one example there. And then on Facebook, Facebook has a feature called Safety Check, right? People go to Safety Check, and often in times of disasters and other sorts of events. And alongside Safety Check, they show news stories, right? News stories that are supposed to provide context about what's happening. And in this case, Facebook was also pulling in misinformation, pulling in sort of hyper-partisan news stories, pulling in far-right sort of news sources, also things that were misidentifying victims and the shooter and things like that.
So this was coming from trolls, either propaganda reasons, either pulling pranks, whatever. Their false information was popping up right at the top of these screens, Facebook and Google. How does that happen, that the fake stuff gets to the top of our attention?
Yeah. So both of these services rely on algorithms, basically complex systems of code, right, that help sort through all of the different sources of news and information across the internet and figure out kind of what to surface, right? What's the most important thing to kind of put at the top of people's search results or, at the top of people's Facebook pages. And the reason they use these algorithms, right, is because there's just so much on the internet, right, that they say, it's impossible for humans to kind of sift through it all. And they kind of have a point, right? There's just so much there that you would need thousands, if not more, armies of humans to actually sort through it. And so they've turned to these algorithms to sort of make a lot of those choices, right? And what we see in these cases is that oftentimes they can be wrong, right?
Yeah,
they can be
algorithms fail.
They fail, and that's exactly what happened in this case, right? Where Google basically said they rely on a bunch of different signals, right, that determine what gets placed into that top stories box, right? It depends on things like how many people are searching for a particular keyword, the authoritativeness of the actual news source, right, the freshness of the source. And in this case, it was a confluence of signals, in particular that sort of freshness that somehow managed to surface 4chan, which is sort of the polar opposite of what you should be sort of sourcing as a news source. It was putting it in that sort of box, which kind of makes you wonder, well, why wasn't that something that perhaps was more proactively identified as something that should never, ever appear in that box as it did
Well,
here?
that's the big question. So what we've heard both from Facebook and Google is, we're sorry, because this fake news was allowed to become spread as a real top story. But beyond the apology, I mean, these are companies that have been criticized for not doing enough to keep fake news off their front pages, and they failed again. I mean, what are the consequences of this? Just from, certainly the consequences in terms of erosion of public trust in information and in the company's ability to police said information. But what else is a result of this?
I mean, if you look at what these companies have been doing over the past few months, right, in the wake of the U.S. election, in which, platforms like Facebook in particular, but also Google and Twitter have been accused of influencing the outcome of the election, you've seen these companies respond by pouring all of this money into education campaigns, into literacy campaigns, and trying to educate people how to spot fake news, right, and misinformation. But it's a little rich, right, when it turns out that these companies are continuing to support the spread of that information and support the spread of these hoaxes and things like that. And so you end up with this situation where, I think increasingly people are asking for a few things, right? They're saying, well, it would be really, really useful for us to better understand how these systems work and how these decisions are made, how these algorithms end up sourcing these information. And that's something that these companies haven't been particularly forthcoming about. I mean, it's possible that in response to sort of the inquiries that are happening in the States right now, that more of that information might come to light. But in the absence of that, we're really left to wonder sort of how. The other thing that we hear a lot is, why not introduce more humans into the loop, right? It's become clear that the algorithms on their own aren't really able to do this job, right, of understanding what is important, the context around stories, especially when there's breaking news. And I mean, is that really surprising given how difficult it is for humans in the first place to be able to sift through kind of what's important and what's factual and correct in breaking news situations? It's really, really difficult for humans. I can imagine it's also difficult for algorithms even more so. And so there's these questions around, should these companies be introducing more humans into the loop? And I think that's something that you've seen some resistance from, because these companies really do want to paint themselves as these neutral parties, these nonpartisan platforms. They're not news organizations. They don't have editorial slants or biases. It's just the algorithms making these decisions. But I think we've seen that, time and time again, it hasn't worked.
And the consequences of such. Taming the trolls, perhaps, needs to fall in other hands. So we'll watch that. Matthew, thank you. I really appreciate your coming in here in studio. And there's more online about this because Matthew's been thinking on and writing about this, taking a wider look at algorithms and their behaviors and how investigators are ready to put them under the microscope. And again, the impetus perhaps coming from what we've been covering in Las Vegas most recently. Check it out on our website, cbcnews.ca.